What is up my people, and welcome back to Technological Journey episode 9. So in the last episode we built our rocket and we took a trip to the moon where we could get more rutile. In today's episode we're going to set up a chemical line for epoxy, and we're also going to use the titanium that we set up last episode to make a space station and a warp core, which will allow us to travel to the next planet in this pack, Phobos. So before we start today, just a quick catch up on what I've done in between episodes. I've just gone ahead and expanded our applied logistics storage and added a couple more drives to our drive slot underneath the staircase in the storage room. I added 8 4K storages, which comes out to about 5 times as much applied logistics storage as we previously had. I also expanded our auto crafting infrastructure slightly, adding an autoclave with water and adding a couple of pattern expansion cards to the interfaces so that we can store more recipes per interface. And then of course I just used the EBFs to batch up some more stainless steel, as well as a couple extra stacks of Canthal for some more EBFs in the future. Now the first little thing that we're going to set up today is just going to be a way to produce carbon dust, because I keep checking the system and realising that we are constantly low on the stuff. Now the best way to do this I think would probably be to centrifuge rubber wood, although that does give us a whole bunch of byproducts here which we're going to have to deal with, although that's not too big of a deal. Plant balls, wood pulp, sticky resin, we all have in drawers with void upgrades, and I've also got a drawer for carbon dust. And then we also get methane, so I just added another little tank on to our mains fluid storage upstairs, and that will deal with the methane for us. But what I'm going to do is down here in the chemistry room, I'm just going to place a centrifuge here, and then I'm going to go ahead and just chuck an item filter in here for rubber wood, set that to insert and then extract on brown. And then I also need to stock rubber wood in this interface here. And then we just need to add a fluid interface to the system. And then we can just wrench this centrifuge to this side and turn on auto fluid output. And we should not be getting anything stocked up in this inventory here. Now we are going to need to connect this fluid interface to the system. So for that I'm just going to use some ME conduits and add a ME conduit to this bundle here. And then just go ahead and level limit this to 2000 carbon dust. Now over here in fluid storage, if we take a look at our biodiesel tank, we can see we only have 700,000 millibuckets in here. Now obviously that is quite a lot, but we have got this level limit to 1 million millibuckets, and so I'm kind of curious as to why this isn't filling up all the way. Now it turns out that that's because we have actually run out of canola and we're not producing it fast enough over here in this farming station. Now for now I'm not going to upgrade the farming station in size just because we're going to switch away from biodiesel relatively soon, but I think that the issue here is probably just this power. Now in the comments of one of the earlier episodes, I think it was 1 or 2, somebody did actually mention how inefficient this wiring is. So we're going to sort that out now. I'm going to switch this out for an MB diesel turbine, or diesel generator, sorry, and just move it up closer so we're getting less cable loss. So it turns out that doing that wasn't actually enough to support the biodiesel setup. So I went ahead and I just upgraded our double layer capacitor to an octadic capacitor, and it changes the size of the farming station from a 9x9 to 11x11. So with the farming station set up, we're now slowly regaining our biodiesel supply. But with the setup of our next production line, which is going to be epoxy, we're still going to be using more fuel than we actually are creating. So I'm just going to temporarily turn off our titanium EBF by right clicking it with a soft hammer. And that should just save us some power consumption. And since we have 107 titanium in store, we're not too worried about producing much more for now. So before we can get epoxy, I just want to set up some sodium hydroxide production. And that's because epoxy needs sodium hydroxide, and then our biodiesel setup also uses tiny piles of sodium hydroxide. Now the biodiesel setup down here, I'm just manually putting in the tiny piles of sodium hydroxide into this final chemical reactor here. And that's sustainable for now because we're not using too much of it because it only takes 1 per 10 buckets of biodiesel. But for the epoxy setup we're going to want sodium hydroxide automated. And to do that I'm just going to set up an advanced chemical reactor back here on the back of our cobbleworks with an integrated circuit of 1, where we input sodium dust, which we have passived, and water. And then I'm just going to level limit this to stock 100 sodium hydroxide dust. And that also makes us hydrogen as a byproduct. So, with sodium hydroxide sorted, we can now look at getting our epoxy set up. Now, this is our first chemical line which we're going to really want to upgrade later in the pack. Once we get LCRs, we're going to move it all into LCRs. And it's also quite an involved process in comparison to some of the things that we've previously been doing. So I'm going to try and explain this as best I can, but it's always best to go look up a flowchart or plan it out in a creative world if you want to build it yourself. But here we go. So starting from the top, we're making epoxy resin, and we're making that in a chemical reactor with sodium hydroxide dust, bisphenol A and epichlorohydrin. The epichlorohydrin we're making with hydrochloric acid and glycerol. Glycerol obviously comes from a biodiesel, and then hydrochloric acid we get through another process further down the line, which I'll talk about in a second. Going back to the bisphenol A, we're making that in a chemical reactor with hydrochloric acid, acetone and phenol. Now the acetone we're making in a fluid heater by heating up calcium acetate solution, which we get by using a chemical reactor with calcium, oxygen and acetic acid. The acetic acid we get with 2 carbon dust, hydrogen and oxygen, all in a chemical reactor. And then going back to the phenol, we're making that in a chemical reactor with 6 sodium hydroxide dust and 1000 millibuckets of dichlorobenzene. The dichlorobenzene we're making in a chemical reactor with chlorine and benzene, and that makes us the hydrochloric acid which we use later. Now the benzene we're making by distilling wood tar, and wood tar we get by processing wood through a pyrolysis oven, which gives us charcoal and wood tar as an output. Now there are some chemicals in this setup which can be looped, so I've just stuck on a couple of extra machines onto the end to help loop the chemicals where possible. And the machines that I've got doing that are an electrolyzer, which is electrolysing salt water into sodium hydroxide dust, chlorine and hydrogen. I've got a single block distillery distilling diluted hydrochloric acid into hydrochloric acid, and then I've got an electrolyzer electrolysing hydrochloric acid into chlorine and hydrogen. So that just helps loop the chemicals where possible. So we have our epoxy set up. Now we're not actually going to use this really until next episode, but I'm just going to talk about here for the epoxy resin. I've just level limit this to 100,000 millibuckets or 100 buckets. That just means that up here in fluid storage, once this reaches 100 buckets, we're going to save on some power consumption and therefore our biodiesel consumption as well. So we're almost ready to move on, but before we do that, I just want to grab a bucket of epoxy so that we can complete the quest in here, and it also gives us another bucket. So I'm just going to go ahead and empty these in here. So that's got us our epoxy, and next episode we'll probably solidify these into epoxy sheets, and that will help us get through to creating our first micro circuits, which allow us to go up to IV using the micro mainframe, and it also gives us obviously cheaper recipes for tier 1, 2, 3, etc. circuits. So now we've got our epoxy, which will just be generating in the background. We can go down here to the space and dimensions tab. Now what I want to get is I want to get the space station assembler and the warp core sorted. But before we do that, I'm just going to talk about this quest here. So this was the quest that we completed last episode, to the moon. Now, I know I talked last episode about getting dislocators and how that was an entire process which we couldn't do because the end was sort of gated behind some EV progression. But this quest actually gives us 2 dislocators here. Now, I haven't claimed those yet because we're not actually going to use them to go to and from the moon, because although rutile is quite important, it's a lot easier to get to the moon than it is to get to the next planet that we're going to go to. So I'm going to claim them and probably set one up on Phobos and then one over there, just to allow us to teleport to and from rather quickly. But in order to get to Phobos, we need to get a space station assembler, which essentially allows us to launch a space station and build it up in space by packaging a couple of blocks into the space station assembler, sending it up on a rocket, and then it builds it automatically for you up in space. And then once we have our space station, we need these blocks here for the warp core. And then you build the warp core on the space station, and it allows you to teleport the space station to different planets. And then you use your rocket, which you take up to the space station, to get down onto the planets. Now, there's a bunch of things that we need here for the warp core. Most of them just require some HV components and some stainless steel. But the actual warp core itself is a little bit more expensive. So we need titanium, which we've got, EV circuits, which are quite expensive at the moment, but we can get. But one thing that we haven't got yet is an EV machine hull. And we have everything to get this. We have the polyethylene sheets, titanium plates, and we can make this using titanium. But we do need aluminium cables. Now this is made the same as any other cables in the assembler, but the thing that's new is we can't use polyethylene sheets to coat these cables. So we're going to need to set up a tiny chemical line first. And I'm going to go with the polyphenylene sulfide foil. So obviously that means we need polyphenylene sulfide, which is made in a chemical reactor. We're going to do this recipe down here with dichlorobenzene, which follows the same process that we set up in the epoxy line, sodium sulfide and oxygen, and sodium sulfide is just made in a mixer with sulfur and sodium. Now this also gives us 4 salt, which we're going to go ahead and electrolyse back into chlorine and sodium. So the sodium loops within the system, And I think the chlorine also loops, because we're going to get 2 buckets of chlorine from this, and then as a product of our dichlorobenzene reaction, we're also going to get 2 buckets of hydrochloric acid, which again we can electrolyse into chlorine, and then we'll also get some excess hydrogen. So I think the only inputs for this are in fact going to be oxygen, sulfur and benzene. So that's not too difficult. I'm just going to go ahead and set that up downstairs in chemistry. So that's all sorted down here. Now the way I've set this up is I've actually got the entire process level limit to the plate as opposed to the fluid. Now I do also have a fluid tank upstairs in main fluid storage for polyphenylene sulfide, but that's not actually getting filled up because we're inputting it straight into this fluid solidifier and turning it into plates, and then once we've got 200 of them, the entire process will stop. The reason for that is because the only use of these polyphenylene sulfide pieces at the moment is for the foil. And the foil is obviously made in a cluster mill with the plates, so I feel like we might as well just stick the fluid solidifier here rather than moving it somewhere else in the world. And while I was building this, we had a chance to restock our biodiesel, so it's up to 1 million millibuckets again. And I turned back on our titanium EBF while I was building this, so we can build up some more titanium for the warp core. And then I also went ahead and just replaced our bending machine and our lathe with MV machines up in the auto crafting setup, just to speed up some of our auto crafting a bit. So with our polyphenylene sulfide now sorted, we have the capability to coat aluminium cables, which essentially means we have everything we need, or we can get everything we need to craft the warp core. So from this point out, to complete these 2 quests here, it's essentially just going to be a bunch of encoding patterns and a bunch of crafting. Now I've already made the space station assembler just because that was just a bunch of HV components which we'd already seen before. So I'm just going to get everything crafted up for this quest here, which is 15 blocks of titanium, space station ID chip which actually uses some advanced rocketry circuits, and the linker which we previously had to make the chip here, and then a bunch of other things, and then obviously the warp core. So this chest here has everything we should need to build the warp core, and then I've got another linker tool here which I can't remember whether or not we'll need. Now this is quite poorly documented, as is quite a commonly known thing that advanced rocketry is a bit of a confusing mod, I guess. But I think the first thing that we need to do here is just disassemble the rocket. And to do that, if we just shift click on this and press disassemble, then the rocket comes back into its individual pieces and we can just pick them up like so. So let's just mine out this here. Now to actually make the space station itself, we need to place down our space station assembler on the side of the launch pad, like so. It actually looks like this needs RF, so I'm just going to replace this with the rocket station, or whatever it's called, the fueling station. We can replace this back after. And now we just need to build a little thing here. Now this is what our space station is going to be assembled as up in space, I guess. So let's just build a plus sign of cork blocks here. Now if we go into the assembler and we place a satellite bay and our space station ID chip, and then we can scan, and it says ready, so it's scanned the cork blocks there, and then we go build. Now we'll get a space station ID chip with our station 1, and we'll also get a space station package or container thing here. Now if we pick up our space station assembler, because we don't need that anymore, and we place back down the fueling station, and then we go ahead and rebuild our rocket. Now the only thing we need to do different this time is we also need to add a satellite bay. And then in the satellite bay, we need to place our space station container, which has our cork blocks. And in the guidance computer, we need to place our space station ID chip. Now I forgot to actually scan this rocket, so I think we're going to have to scan it and rebuild it. And then you can see if we get on the rocket now, it says destination station 1. So that should take us up to our space station and automatically build those cork blocks, which we can obviously expand on once we're in space. So we're up in space and onto our space station. And now if I get off the rocket, being careful not to fall off the edge here. Now I brought up some other bits and bobs in terms of blocks to build out the space station. For now I'm just going to focus on building a platform so that we can get the warp core going, but in the future I do actually want to design quite a cool, like, sort of aesthetically looking space station. So I managed to do that. It was a very close call, and for some reason the hitbox of the rocket's a bit strange, so it's really hard to place these blocks in here. But I'm just going to expand this out a little bit this way just so we can build the warp core. It's obviously not going to look very nice at the moment, but I guess we can deal with that. Now to do this, I'm actually just going to use a new tool that I haven't really used in this pack yet, and that's going to be effortless building. And this essentially just allows you to build larger shapes in a much quicker fashion just by selecting essentially what you want to do. Now for some reason it's not going to let me go over here, but that's fine. And then you can see I can just place all of that in one. There are a bunch of different shapes available with this menu, which I've got set to O as a keybind, but it'll obviously be different for you. So this is actually quite a cool tool that I haven't really talked about much in this playthrough yet. So let's just make this a square. So now we've got a platform. We just need to get this thing here called a hollow projector. And now if we shift right click in here, we can pick something to project essentially. And if we just scroll down, we should see somewhere here the warp core. So now we select that, and we should be able to project. Let's get this in the center actually. So if we place this in the middle of the platform here, now you can use shift and scroll to show the different layers. So we're going to start on the bottom layer, and then if we just build this out as it's shown in the projection. Apparently I'm missing a titanium block, so let me just go back and grab that real quick. And now when we place this down up here, the warp core should form. There we go. Now this actually looks pretty cool. I didn't realise it looked like this. Now in order to get this thing to work and to teleport us to Phobos, we need a couple of things. We need a warp controller, which can go anywhere on the space station. It's just sort of the interface for the warp core. We need some dilithium, which I just got through autoclaving dilithium dust, and we get that through just smelting dilithium ore, which we obviously get from the moon. Now if we put this up in the input hatch, I'm not sure how much we're going to need, so I'm just going to put, I think it was 4 stacks I put in there. And you can see we get this little animation here, and that just shows that we have fuel in the warp core. And now we open the warp controller, and we select the planet that we want. So currently we're around the Sol star. So if we press up, then we get these 2 stars here. So if we select Sol 235, double click that, and then we select Phobos here, and double click that. Now we select this planet, which I've done, select, and it says Phobos here. And you can see it says fuel 1000, fuel cost 500, so that means it's going to use half of our dilithium that we put in the warp core. But it does say that we have a missing artifact. Now an artifact is essentially just a different type of block that you need to specify which planet you're going to. Now in the quest book here for the different planets it tells you what the artifacts are. So from Mars for example we need a block of californium, Titan will need charcoal logs, Mercury platinum, Pluto tungsten carbide, but for Phobos it's just a block of salt, which I've got here. And then if we go into the warp selection, if we go into the planet tracking tab and we place a block of salt in there, I believe it says now that we are ready to warp. Now before we warp over to Phobos, the main reason that we're going there is obviously to collect chlorine and fluorine veins. And in order to mine those up, we're obviously going to need to use a fluid drilling rig. So I just went over and I mined up our old oil fluid drilling rig from back in the overworld. And so I've got all of the pieces here that we need to rebuild it over on Phobos on top of a chlorine vein. So let's go ahead and warp. And it looks like we've made it. So the planet that we're now above should be Phobos. Yep, orbiting Phobos. Lovely. Now in order to get down, we obviously just need to sit back on our rocket. Destination Phobos, it already says. And if we press space, then we're ready to zoom off down to Phobos where we can set up our fluid drill. Now something I can't say I was expecting is to be submerged in water in our rocket, but I guess that's supposed to happen. Or at least I hope that's supposed to happen. Right, so I've set a waypoint and I've waited for day. And it actually looks like over there we have a little island, so I'm just going to go ahead and zoom over here real quick. So I've made it to the land, and alongside the fluid drilling rig blocks, I also brought over our solar fluid sampler and our solar panel. And that's just to help us find our fluid vein that we need to find. And using the same process as last time, we're just going to put in a data stick, wait for it to run, and then we'll find out what fluids we have down underneath the ground. So it appears that this chunk here has a fluid vein, and as you can see the capacity is extremely high. Now I think that is the max integer limit, but I might be wrong. But either way, what I'm trying to get at is the fluid veins on this planet are pretty much endless. So we're not going to have to really worry about moving our drill too much, other than maybe upgrading it for a higher throughput later on. But let's just go try find a chunk that has chlorine, because we don't need fluorine just yet. So I've done a bit more exploring, and I found this cool alien forest biome with purple grass and purple dirt. But most importantly, this chunk here has a very large fluid of chlorine vein. So we've got this all ready here, so let's just clear out a little space and let's go ahead and build our fluid drilling plant. And then just using the same setup that we had over in the overworld, I'm just going to go ahead and sort out our power using steam coming from this steam ender tank. And you can see we're already drilling up chlorine. Now it looks like these generators aren't actually getting enough steam, so I am going to go ahead and put some extraction upgrades in this conduit to do that. But one thing that I do want to talk about is the way that we're transporting fluid back into the overworld. So I also picked up the ender tank that we have with oil, and even though it's full of oil at the moment, I'm just going to put it here on the output, and then when we go back to the overworld we're going to switch this ender tank over. We're going to extract the oil, and switch it over to transfer chlorine. And then we'll obviously hook this up to main fluid storage, so we'll just be inputting the chlorine directly from here back into main fluid storage at the base. But the first thing that I want to do is I want to go ahead and take out our handy bag real quick so that we can access the claim chunks, and I want to go ahead and chunk load the area that we are currently in. That's just because otherwise this chunk here and this drill will not be running while we're back in the overworld. So I'm going to go ahead, grab some extract upgrades and transfer this over to chlorine, and then I'll meet you back in fluid storage. So that concludes our trip to Phobos, and I think we can mark that down as a decent success. Now the chlorine throughput here is quite low. We obviously do still have chlorine coming from our, I think it's an electrolyzer setup downstairs in the chemistry room, but this is going to be our main production of chlorine from now on, and it is quite slow, so I am probably going to want to upgrade the drill to the next fluid plant at some point soon, but we don't need to worry about that right now because we've just got this set up and working, and it's nice to have this sort of working in the background for us because we are constantly low on chlorine. But I think that is a good point to finish this episode, as we have completed everything that we said we would do. We've got epoxy, we also made a couple of other chemical lines to get us to epoxy, and we had a successful trip to Phobos which enabled us to get chlorine, and we'll be able to get fluorine from there very soon as well. Now, I know I talked about this all last episode, but once again I want to apologise for the delay it took before uploading this episode. Normally I try and upload once a week. This one I think took about 2 weeks to upload, and the reason for that was because advanced rocketry, to be honest, I really dislike it. Like, I just don't find it fun at all. It's just sort of going through the motions to me. There's no creativity that you get from building, and there's none of the sort of, I guess, intellectual challenge almost that you get from designing efficient GregTech chemical lines. So it's just part of the pack that I don't really enjoy. So I did take a 2-day break in between some clips of this episode. Hopefully that's not too evident, but I did do it, and that's why it took so long to record this episode. But hopefully we should be back to uploading every week now, because we're past the advanced rocketry progression stage for the minute. We are going to need to do a bit more in the future, but that's not too bad. I didn't want to cut it out this episode because I feel like some people might enjoy the progression in advanced rocketry, and I want to sort of keep this series open to everyone and representative of the pack progression as a whole. I didn't want to skip over some key bits, but that should be why. So again, sorry for the delay, but I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, as always, please do leave a like. It massively helps the channel gain traction, and even though I'm not too bothered about gaining a big audience or a big following, I do enjoy interacting with you guys in the comments and giving me tips on what to do in the base and helping you out wherever I can. That's probably the bit I enjoy about making this the most, actually. And if you enjoyed the series, subscribe as well, because then you can get notified for the future episodes that are coming out. Next episode I reckon is going to be a decent one, because we're going to be setting up polytetrafluoroethylene, which means we can get our LCRs and upgrade some of our lines. But on that note, it's been me. Hope you enjoyed the episode,